It would be the biggest geopolitical shock in modern history. Not a war. Not a treaty. But a peaceful, democratic decision where the entire nation of Canada, from Vancouver's Pacific shores to the frozen frontier of Nunavut, agrees to dissolve itself and become the 51st state of the United States of America. How did we get here? And what would this mean for the world, for America, and for Canadians themselves? To imagine this scenario, you have to erase centuries of identity. Because Canada is not just America's northern neighbor. It is its own distinct civilization. A parliamentary democracy. A bilingual, multicultural federation that stayed loyal to the British Crown even as America broke away in revolution. They fought beside each other in world wars. They traded across the world's longest undefended border. They shared media, celebrities, and even dreams. But they were never the same country. Until now. Let's say a referendum was held. Across all 10 provinces and 3 territories. The ballots were clear. Do you support the dissolution of Canada and its admission into the United States as one or more U.S. states? And somehow miraculously, or tragically, the answer was yes. First, the shock. The international community would be stunned. The United Nations would demand answers. The UK would be politically humiliated. Canada is still a Commonwealth realm, and King Charles III its ceremonial monarch. China and Russia would denounce the move as an imperial expansion by Washington. Europe would scramble to renegotiate trade deals. And within Canada, thousands would protest, even riot. This isn't a policy shift. This is the end of a nation. And in Washington? Confusion. Elites would be divided. Some would cheer the birth of a supercontinent, where the U.S. expands from sea to sea with greater Arctic access and abundant resources. Others would panic at the implications, new political rivals, cultural tensions, and billions in social service costs. But the vote was binding. And the world couldn't stop what came next. The legal maze. Annexation is not simple. Technically, the U.S. Constitution allows new states to be admitted. But Canada isn't a territory. It's a sovereign G7 country. To become a state, or multiple states, Canada would have to dissolve its own constitution, disband Parliament, repeal the Canada Act, and sever all provincial charters. Then, each region would apply to the U.S. Congress for admission as a new state. Would America accept them all? Would they carve up Canada into 10 to 13 new states? Or merge some together? Maybe Atlantic Canada becomes one state, and the Prairie Provinces another? The debates would rage in Capitol Hill. Suddenly, America would be absorbing over 40 million new citizens. That's like adding California and New York combined. The economic earthquake. Canada's GDP is over $2 trillion, ranking 9th in the world. Merging that into the U.S. economy would create a North American superpower unlike anything before. But harmonizing the two economies wouldn't be painless. Canada has universal healthcare. America does not. Would Medicare for all suddenly become reality? Or would millions of Canadians lose their coverage and be thrown into the chaotic U.S. insurance market? Then there's taxes. Canada has a value-added tax, VAT, higher personal taxes, and stronger welfare systems. Would Canadians now be subject to U.S. tax laws? Would Social Security cover them? Trade would be rewritten. There'd be no more border. No more customs between British Columbia and Washington, or between Ontario and Michigan. The Trans-Canada Highway would become part of the U.S. interstate system. And pipelines? Keystone XL would finally be a domestic project. Wall Street would surge, at least short-term. Resource companies would rejoice. America would inherit vast oil sands, rare earth deposits, uranium mines, and freshwater reserves. But indigenous land claims, environmental lawsuits, and regulatory collisions would quickly ignite the political explosion. Overnight, America's political map would be redrawn. Depending on how Canada was divided, the U.S. Senate could gain 20 to 26 new senators. And most of them? would be Democrats. The liberal strongholds of Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal would tilt the national balance. Republicans would fight back, demanding conservative Alberta and Saskatchewan become their own states to even the numbers. Presidential elections would change forever. No candidate could ignore the new Canadian states. Suddenly, the road to the White House would run through Winnipeg and Halifax. But here's the irony: Canada doesn't elect presidents. Its culture doesn't revolve around strongman politics. The shock of U.S. polarization, culture wars, and hyperpartisanship would hit Canadians like a freight train. Fox News would flood into every home. Gun rights debates would escalate. Abortion laws in deeply religious Canadian regions like rural Alberta or Quebec would now be under Washington's control. And the Supreme Court? No longer a distant symbol. It would now determine the fate of Canadians. The cultural collision. Canadians pride themselves on civility, politeness, social unity. But the American cultural machine is louder, brasher, more divided. The Stars and Stripes would replace the maple leaf. "O Canada" would no longer be sung at hockey games. The loonie and toonie would vanish, replaced by the US dollar. National symbols like the RCMP, the Governor General, and CBC would either be dismantled or absorbed. French-speaking Quebec would erupt. Its identity, already fragile, would be under threat. Would Quebec become a U.S. state? Or secede and finally become independent? Many argue the referendum would never have passed in Quebec in the first place. But in this scenario, the majority across Canada agreed. And now, the consequences unfold. The military shift. Canada's military is small but respected. It would now be absorbed into the U.S. Armed Forces. Canadian Forces bases would be rebranded as U.S. military installations. NORAD would be fully American-led. More alarmingly, nuclear policy would change. Canada has no nuclear weapons. But as part of the U.S., it could now host them. Would American nukes be stationed in the Arctic? Would Russia view this as a threat? Would China retaliate in the Pacific? Suddenly, peaceful Canadian soil becomes part of America's global war infrastructure. And for many Canadians, that's a red line. Social identity crisis. Who are Canadians, if not Canadian? Many would refuse to identify as American. They'd cling to their heritage. Fly Canadian flags from their homes. Speak French with defiance. Continue celebrating July 1st as Canada Day, even if the country no longer exists. Others would embrace the change. New opportunities, open borders, and the thrill of being part of the world's most powerful nation would excite many, especially the young and ambitious. Immigration would also change. Canada's famously generous refugee and asylum system would be replaced by U.S. border policies. Thousands of asylum seekers who crossed into Canada fleeing U.S. deportation would now be trapped. And Indigenous communities, who had treaties with the Canadian Crown, would now have to fight Washington for recognition. The world watches. What message would this send? To struggling democracies, it may look like surrender. To separatist movements in Scotland, Catalonia, or Taiwan, it would raise dangerous questions. To American allies, it would raise trust issues. If Canada can dissolve, who's next? And to adversaries like Russia or Iran, it might be proof of U.S. expansionism. They'd label it a silent annexation. They'd use it in propaganda. The global balance of power would shift. North America would be unchallengeable in territory, resources, and defense. But internally? The new United States would be more divided than ever. Resistance and rebellion. Some Canadians wouldn't take it sitting down. Underground independence movements would rise. Flags would be burned. Radicals would call for secession. In Quebec, perhaps even civil unrest. The Parti Québécois could be reborn, only now not fighting Canada, but the United States. Former Canadian politicians might create advocacy groups or shadow parliaments. Indigenous groups would take their land claims to the U.S. Supreme Court and possibly even to The Hague. And in U.S. cities, a new diaspora would emerge. Former Canadians. A community holding tight to values, language, and traditions rapidly disappearing in the American melting pot. The long-term vision. Could it work? Perhaps. Over decades, cultural integration might take hold. New states like Ontario or British Columbia could become economic powerhouses. America's Arctic access could revolutionize shipping. Toronto might rival New York and Los Angeles as a media capital. But the risk of division would remain. Old Canadian values, universal healthcare, strict gun control, bilingualism would clash with U.S. norms. And if the American system doesn't adapt, it won't be Canada that changes America. It'll be America that erases Canada. So, what if? What if Canada became the 51st state? A world power would expand. A nation would vanish. Millions would gain and millions would grieve. It would be historic, no doubt. But maybe the biggest question isn't what would happen. Maybe it's should it ever happen. And to that, there may never be a clear answer.